what does your brand stand for? What is the culture of your brand that potentially attracts and brings people in to be community members? And what I see on the timeline typically, and I won't name names, is, and I'm not trying to fun anyone, is I'll see folks that go in this extremely technical direction, right? And what I say to myself as a marketer is, okay, they're trying to position themselves as a business, sophisticated, serious, blah, 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 right? I get, but a lot of that content it's not accessible for the everyday person, right? And it also doesn't really invoke any like emotion or feeling. And that's a little bit of a cornerstone of community building.
Welcome back to Block Fuel Podcast. We are joined by Andrew Saunders, who's the new CMO over at Skale. So we had a chance to talk with your CEO a few weeks back, but really excited. I know we've become friendly over the past couple of weeks or past couple of months or so. So Andrew, welcome to the Block Fuel Podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me, my friends. Always a pleasure.
So you have a prolific background, right? CMO over at Arbitrum. And then you came from like Web2 as well with Amazon, being the head of entertainment and culture. Worked at NBC Universal, I believe, CAA. So you come from traditional world and we're in this ecosystem ourselves in crypto land. But coming from that, what did you notice first as you entered into Web3, coming from more of a Web2 background?
Yeah, great question. A couple things I'll nod to. So I'm also an LP in a venture fund that's in Web2. So I've invested in a lot of direct-to-consumer businesses that have actually done pretty well. So examples like Roam, Coterie Premium Diapers has done quite well as well. But it's interesting because when I first got here, I think especially on the marketing side, a lot of people talk about like the challenges in Web3 marketing and the differences between Web3 and Web2 marketing. But I also just going back in history, I've worked at a lot of different startups. I've helped incubate a lot of startups from the ground up. And there's a lot of things that I've noticed are just very common for just early stage industries, not even early stage companies. And so a lot of it's not very shocking to me, but I would say the biggest thing to call out is, again, we know the numbers. It's like only 5% of the population is on chain. And a lot of people look at Twitter and they say Twitter is the end all be all for crypto and quote unquote traditional marketing doesn't work. But I think it's less about traditional marketing not working and more about the audience. Because if you look at a lot of these early crypto natives, these are contrarians, these are libertarians that are maybe a little more adverse to traditional marketing and advertising. But you have to take a step back and go, I know that this industry is so early, and I was early in VR, AR, AI, machine learning, digital, social, all these areas. So I've seen this many times. I do think as time goes on and as we start to see more mass adoption and more everyday folks coming on chain, a lot of the tactics that have worked in Web2 are going to work in Web3. I think it's just the audience that's here right now is very different. And so that means things like opt-in marketing, like content marketing, doing things that are native to Web3 technology, like quests, and then also leading into things like community building, which is not new to crypto. That's a cornerstone of a lot of early D2C companies from 10 years ago. So I think, again, it's just the audience composition today is very different from what it'll be tomorrow. And you just have to understand those differences. And as a result, really just pivot and steer your strategy in directions that are going to resonate with those early adopters.
Yeah. Andrew, I know you've definitely seen the memes past 2 years of here's this massive amount of people that are all like staffed and engineers working on crypto from like 2018 to 2021. And then that huge flood exodus goes into AI. And they're like, hey, here's all these like AI developers suddenly now. And then it's going to be something else. And you were exposed to a lot of this, right? You just said that at like Amazon, you have these new technologies, you have very smart people working on them, and there's different ways to monetize it and build products. How did you decide, hey, like blockchain and crypto isn't just money, there's a lot more here, and this is where I want to take my career?
Yeah, great question. So it's pretty simple story. I'm working at Amazon headquarters. I built a multi-country, multi-product business. And candidly, like going into COVID, a lot of e-commerce did extremely well, right? And I think it's safe to say a lot of times what goes up must come down. And so I've always been a little bit of a first mover in my career. I've always skated to where the puck's going, even if it's a little too early. And so I said to myself, listen, a lot of industries are shrinking right now. A lot of industries are going to be consolidating. Like when I worked in media, it was constant consolidation. I want to go into an area that's growing. And so very simply started calling traditional Web2 VC friends at places like Andreessen and Lightspeed and just ask them, where are you investing today? Where are you investing tomorrow? Because that's where the growth's going to be. Most of them all highlighted the same four industries, two of which are not very friendly to marketing, in my opinion. And so it really boiled down to climate tech and crypto. And I've worked in climate tech actually about 20 years ago. And so I know that industry is very much impacted and dictated by politics. And so with Web3, I had already gotten the crypto pill, as we like to call it. And again, I came in through Ethereum. I didn't really come in through Bitcoin. And again, as someone that's been, I think, an early adopter in a lot of different technologies, I started to understand like the implications of blockchain technology and the impact it can have on so many sectors. So obviously, a lot of people like to point to DeFi, the financial sector, but the gaming sector, now the AI sector, Deepin, which back in the day we called Internet of Things. But even now, I'm seeing climate tech launch. I'm really interested in decentralized science, DeSci. And so it was pretty easy for me to look at the Fortune 500 and go, blockchain has the ability to impact pretty much every single sector here, even things like big auto. It's early. If I have a first mover advantage by getting into the industry early, there's just a ton of growth opportunity and potential for me. And that's been the case. I get, even to this day, I'm getting 10 CMO offers a week. Very happy at Scale. So you can stop sending the emails, but it's the fact that this is a growing industry. There's constant funding coming in. I am starting to see more founders jumping over from traditional Web2 backgrounds, or even things like indie game studios building blockchain titles on top of their existing business. And a lot of that I didn't see 2 years ago when I entered. I think back then there weren't a ton of founders coming from Web2 backgrounds, big tech backgrounds, traditional business backgrounds. Just the uptick in that over the past 2 years has been pretty incredible.
What's it been like coming from Amazon, right? I'd imagine you probably had a billion, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but like massive budget probably to work with, right? And now in Web3, I know Scale's pretty, jeez. So yeah, exactly. So and Scale funded, obviously we talked to the CEO, we believe in the company long-term as well. I'd imagine the budgets are not 6 billion. I don't want you to share all your tricks of why you're getting 10 CMO offers a week here, but anything you can share of like someone that you just mentioned, a lot of people are coming from Web2 over to Web3, some expectations, or what have you found success in pretty early on?
Yeah, great question. So yes, I don't have a $6 billion budget anymore. That was our full team budget at Amazon. But no, let me take a step back. So career-wise, like when I was working at CAA, I was architecting partnerships and marketing campaigns with most of the big Fortune 500 companies. And yes, there were brands that would come in and we do $5 million marketing campaigns, but there were also brands that would come in with $50,000, $100,000. And at the end of the day, you're always trying to architect what makes the most sense for each budget. Fast forward, I go to NBC Universal, the numbers go up because obviously I'm the one architecting a lot of these multi-network, multi-platform campaigns. And so those are 150 million, et cetera. But then fast forward when I went to Tastemates, similar to NBC, doing a lot of kind of partner marketing. But again, like in early digital social days, those campaigns can be 50,000, 75,000. And so I think the benefit that I've had is just by working at companies at all different sizes and stages and with companies at all different sizes and stages, like you start to understand how to get scrappy and then also how to make things as efficient and performative as you can. In terms of what works, it's hard to say because again, like what I was saying before is the current native audience is just very different from what I think the audience of the future is going to look like. So in today's day and age, I would say things like content marketing. So I've been a content marketer for 20 years and really the difference is with content marketing, traditional marketing is what's called outbound marketing, right? Or forced exposure, right? So I'm watching TV, I see a 30, I drive down the street, I see a billboard. I'm being forced into seeing that marketing or advertising. With content marketing for the past 20 years, I think a lot of it, I've always referred to it as inbound marketing, where really what you're doing is you're putting content out there, hoping it resonates with certain audiences, and then almost acts to pull them in. And so it's a lot more. But that being said, that doesn't mean you can't put paid media behind that content and try to target very specific audiences just to make sure that the right people get exposed to it that are more likely to get pulled in. Right? And so if you go back to traditional marketing, if you look at a typical annual budget, you have a percentage that goes towards paid media. You have a percentage that goes towards production, creative. You might have experimental budgets. You might have a event budget, things like that. But I would argue to date, a lot of it still holds true. It's just what you classify as what. And what I mean by that is I look at influencer marketing as media, right? You can buy paid ads on Twitter, but you can also do influencer partnerships and get folks with large audiences to put your content out there. And that's really no different than what we call a syndicated media network, meaning I buy on Yahoo, but I need more exposure and they've got a network of 20 sites to run it against. It's the same model.
Mhm.
Over Quest, I look at Quest as media, right? Like I understand they look and feel very different from traditional media formats, but at the end of the day, you're taking sites that can have pretty significant audiences, and then you're really creating an opportunity for them that can bring them on chain or get them to drive some sort of on chain action. And then other things I think that are successful in Web3, like podcasts. Funny enough, when I was at Amazon, like I was tasked to crack the code on podcasts. Do they work? Do they drive ROI? The TLDR is they do. There's very specific like tactics and strategies that I think make them as impactful and as efficient as possible. But at the end of the day, like they do work. And so you can go the crypto native podcast collection direction and get obviously awareness on the back of that. But you can also go more mass media, and we call it personams, but case in point, we have a lot of games building on our blockchain, right? I can run ads on crypto podcasts and make sure that everyone that's already on the blockchain knows about it. But I can also run them on gaming podcasts or entertainment podcasts, and maybe I'm able to capture the attention of someone that hasn't bridged on chain yet. So I think there's just this big misconception in crypto that everything's organic. It's not. And most projects that say everything's organic, they're doing things that aren't organic, but they don't realize it. So what I mean by that is
Right.
like, if you have a project that doesn't have a token yet and you're pre-TGE, you're in what's called the speculation phase, that's not organic. Like you could say it's organic, but it's not. Or
Mhm.
if you're running an incentive campaign, that's not organic. Or if you're working with influencers, but not buying paid ads on Twitter, that's not organic. So I think at the end of the day, like you need to get out of this perception that everything's organic. It's not. And you almost need to the Web2 playbook and just say, okay, now how does that get modified or altered in a way that's going to resonate with this early audience?
I was listening to My First Million. Is that the name, Jody? And they were talking about it as like an audience co-founder that's going to become this new thing where they used to take celebrities, right? But now these KOLs, these influencers, they have millions of people that are pretty like dedicated to them. So it's this growth hack that people are taking a look at of like, all right, how do I get in front of so many people? Maybe it's worth to have, or they were talking about like Fendi Beauty, like Rihanna talking about it constantly now because she's got a huge stake in it or the majority. So that is really a fascinating kind of new paradigm we're seeing in this shift where it's like taking this old celebrity and these micro influencers may have an audience that's bigger than a celebrity.
And it's not new to crypto. Like I can go back, this is probably again like 10, 15 years ago, but go study Revolve, go study Daniel Wellington, even study like Erewhon supermarkets. But these are all, quote unquote, traditional businesses that built and scaled their entire business on the back of influencers. So there's a model that's been out there for a long time. I think one of the challenges in crypto is also just understanding the differences between influencers, meaning there are folks that purely shill things. There are folks that are educating. There are folks that are amplifying in various sectors. And so what I usually tell a lot of companies that I advise is you can't look at influencers or Coles, as they've always been called in Asia, as one size fits all. You've really got to do the due diligence to understand like, who is the audience? Does that audience align with my product or service? And then obviously you're dealing with people, you're not dealing with media companies. So there's also the question of who's easy to work with, who's able to take your key messaging or value props and bring them to life in interesting ways. And so case in point for me, I tend to work with a lot of the same people over and over because I've had really great success with them. But at the same time, let's say I'm launching something new, I'm not naive to the fact that they may not have the right audience. It's no different than television. You're not going to market a financial services product on Lifetime. You're going to market it on CNBC and vice versa. And so if you've been using one of those networks for 5 years, but now you're launching something that caters to a different audience, like you got to shift.
So one of the themes we had just speaking with Jack, CEO of Skale, was Scale's bringing this maturity and this like enterprise software mentality of, okay, if once we actually reach mass adoption, we need to be ready. Everyone building on Scale needs to be ready so that things don't start breaking and it isn't a flub. Coming from CAA, coming from NBC Universal and Amazon, what are some of the, I'd say, mature elements of marketing and go-to-market that you're bringing to Scale that kind of matches that same theme of, okay, and you were just hitting on some of them, but what are some approaches that you're like, hey, Web3 is really missing this, analytics are bad, or they're not getting good return on ad spend, or for all the people that are getting into Web3, like what can they take in that would actually be some good structure to be effective at their jobs?
Yeah, great question. So I think let's start at a high level. So like branding, right? I think one of the biggest misconceptions is if you look at traditional brands, let's take Nike, let's take Coca-Cola, Amazon, whatever it is, most of these are companies that have been building their brands for years and also investing in media for years. So the names, you probably have perceptions, whether they're positive or negative, but they're in your consideration set. And you, in a sense, can see a logo and say, I know what it stands for. And I know what the vibes are. I think in crypto, what I've noticed is there's not a lot of like proper brand development work. And I'll give you a couple examples. So one thing I've noticed is like a lot of brands are all using the exact same colors, which is problematic because again, it's a new industry. You're trying to break out from the pack. There's a lot of noise. You've got to think about how do you differentiate yourself from everybody else. And the second thing is, and I'll give you a great example of this. There's also this question of what does your brand stand for? What is the culture of your brand that potentially attracts and brings people in to be community members? And what I see on the timeline typically, and I won't name names, is, and I'm not trying to fun anyone, is like, I'll see folks that go in this extremely technical direction, right? And what I say to myself as a marketer is, okay, they're trying to position themselves as a business, sophisticated, serious, blah, 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 blah. But a lot of that content it's not accessible for the everyday person. And it also doesn't really invoke any like emotion or feeling. And that's a little bit of a cornerstone of community building. And then on the other side of the table, what I see a lot of is a lot of projects where they're going like ultra degen, like ultra crypto Twitter. And I get it. Like it's a great growth hack, right? It's a lean into what we know folks are interested in, aka inbound marketing. But my concern there is, listen, I'm a degen, I'm a trader. Like we are loyal to one thing, and that is our bags. And so when I see a lot of these new projects being built, I'm like, yeah, they're doing a great job owning the timeline. They're doing a great job building the community. They're doing a great job building a vibe, but it is somewhat similar to everyone else playing that full on degen game. And then the question for me becomes post TGE, does that community actually stick around? Or again, are they just loyal to their bags and now they're going to go somewhere else? And so I think, again, folks just need to take a step back and really think bigger picture and go, let's imagine my company's now existed for 10 years. What does it stand for? What does the logo invoke? What does the name evoke? What are the perceptions that I want to build over the next 10 years? Because brand development takes a long time, right? It is reach and frequency. It's like the more you see the name, the more you see value propositions, the more it starts to sink in. And I feel like a lot of projects that I see are they're thinking very short term. They're thinking like, what's going to work on CT today? Or they're thinking like, what do the degens love? But they're discounting the fact that 95% of the population has yet to even enter.
I was just scrolling your Twitter. We like to bring up random tweets that people have had, and I'm trying to find a good one. So I was just scrolling your timeline. We always try to pull in some tweets, of course. I saw Haven's Compass was reposted a few times. We actually talked with them a little bit through Skale. I know that they're building on Skale as well, but what other like games who are some of the clients? Because I don't want to repeat a lot of the same questions that we asked Jack. What is Skale? We do have another podcast if you're listening to this one to dive in further into Skale, but maybe we can dig into what are some of the, and I know you're only a couple of weeks in, but what are some of the projects you're really excited about, or folks that are listening to this podcast and they're deciding what to build on, like why should they be building on Skale?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the ecosystem. So yes, I'm a few weeks in. Listen, as a CMO, CMGO of an entire ecosystem, like I like to be Switzerland. I do believe in this notion of like everybody should have a fair shot at success. And I really do try to even amplify and support kind of everyone that I can that's here. But on the gaming side, yes, we have over 50 games on Skale to date. I would say if we're looking at maybe some of the blue chips that are starting to emerge, I think one thing that's exciting for me is we have 4 games that are already on the Epic Game Store. And I'll explain why that's really interesting. So that's obviously Haven's Compass, FPS game. Very cool indie studio from Mina that's actually building that. And it's a great game. I've played it already. And then we've also got Fuzzy Fox, which is another game launching that's already on Epic Game Store. We have Stray Shot, which is another shooter game on the Epic Game Store. And then we have World of Dipians. So I would say for anyone that's newer to crypto, like that's a great starting point. And why? Because you can literally go to the Epic Game Store. You can download these games to your PC. You can start playing them. You're not even going to realize any blockchains involved. And that's really like the long-term future of crypto is like the invisible blockchain or the invisible wallet. I do think in 5-10 years time, what's going to happen is you're going to go to a website, you're going to sign in with an email address, you're going to sign in with a password. It's going to auto-generate a backend wallet. And it's invisible now, the same way our blockchain's invisible for these games, right? And so I think one of the things that I can go through stats with you that's been really exciting to me, and probably also one of the reasons I chose to come here, is we've built this really massive user base. So we're the number one chain in terms of active gaming wallets. And I'll go through kind of some of the competition just for comparison. But I think part of that is exactly what I'm talking about, which is you are not in crypto, but you go on Twitch every day to watch gameplay. You see a gamer that you love, a traditional gamer that you love, playing one of these games, saying it's available on the Epic Game Store, not even mentioning crypto or blockchain. Next thing you download it, or you're just going to the Epic Game Store to see what's trending or to see what looks cool. You download these games, you start playing them, you don't even realize they're on the blockchain. And I think that's part of it. I think one thing that I have a hypothesis about is I think for Scale, and I knew this coming in, like our biggest issue is just awareness because we haven't owned the C2 timeline. And it's interesting because there's this disconnect because you've got this massive user base that's extremely engaged playing these games every single day. And then I had this light bulb moment where I was like, oh my God, I think we're actually building a user base of regular people, of normies. And that is extremely hard to do. Like you can't play the incentive game or the airdrop game with these folks. And so that's exciting to me. And the reason why I believe that is because the other thing that I'm seeing is I think we already have 13 games with over 10,000 daily players. And so what that means is what's happening is real gamers are coming in through real gaming channels. And then they're starting to discover other games and they're starting to play those games. And so what I usually say to a lot of builders is if you're building a game for the long run and you actually want to build a successful game and you're not just focused on TGE and token, like this is one of the few places I've seen where you can actually launch a game with a real user base. And funny enough, last weekend I was having dinner with a good friend of mine that works for PlayStation globally. He's like a senior executive at PlayStation. And he was really interested because he's traditional gaming and blockchain haven't always had the best relationship. And I started showing him some of these games on Epic and he was like, wait, these are built on the blockchain. I was like, a lot of them are built on Unity or Unreal Engine. And then really what they're doing is they're connecting to the blockchain for gaming skins and digital assets and that kind of stuff. And he was like, this is cool. Like I would actually play these games, but I couldn't have had that conversation 2 years ago because back then everyone was building games fully on chain and you're reporting for duty every day. You're clicking a transaction button. Like it's not a game, right? But now we're starting to see things that look and feel like traditional video games. And again, we're just so early. So to think, where's this stuff going to be in a year or 2 years or 3 years? I think it's just going to continue to accelerate. Yeah.
And Andrew, I think you saw probably last week that Paradigm, so one of the top VCs in the Web3 crypto, raised a fund that was, I think originally slated to be 500 million and then ended up, they tacked on another 350 million. So now it's 850. Yeah. And part of it, and I don't know if it's just commentary or if it was actually something they put out, was that there was a mandate to not invest in infrastructure, which has been what a lot of infrastructure has been focused on, but really invest in consumer apps. Like what's going to be the next like actual user apps that people are using. And you guys are already funded. You guys already have a team and built, but does that excite you? I guess to hear that, hey, like those are people ideally that are building on top of Scale. And what do you think it's going to be? Like, what do you think those consumer apps are going to be based on?
Yeah, it's extremely exciting. Listen, I'll give you another example of I had about 50 companies courting me and I chose to come to Scale. Like this was my pick. And I'll give you another reason I chose to come here, which aligns perfectly with this. So again, as a guy that's been very early in a lot of different industries, I was very early in social. Like I was working with the Zuckerbergs to onboard celebrities onto Facebook. Biz Stone, founder of Twitter, was our client. This was even like we were working with YouTube directly with the CEO to build media channels. So I've seen this stuff before. And then on the gaming side, just for background, like I've worked with all the big traditional gaming studios. I've worked with King, Candy Crush mobile games. I've worked at Amazon in like cloud gaming and things like that. So again, if you look at my background, like I've worked in pretty much every single consumer sector over the past 20 years. And when I first get into crypto, a lot of people would ask me like, what's going to drive mass adoption? And my response 3 years ago, my response today is pretty much exactly the same. I personally believe what it's going to be is either one breakout video game. And I remember this from like when I was doing World of Warcraft back in the day, we used to work with those guys. Or it's going to be one breakout social app. And I'm not even saying social fi. And that goes not just back to the Facebooks of the world that I worked with, but like, I'm going to date myself here. Like I worked with a company called Feed. I worked with a company called Highlight. Like these are all early social networks. And they all had very fast, explosive, rapid growth. And so I still believe like what's going to happen is we're going to either have a video game in the future that really just breaks out and gets 20 million players. And then the next thing, you've got 20 million folks on chain, potentially invisibly, or it's going to be a new social network that launches. And I think it's less candidly about making money. And I think it's more about like data protection, data ownership, data integrity, that kind of stuff. But same thing, like those two categories to me are the two that I think are most likely to drive mass adoption. So then fast forward, I'm trying to decide where I want to go. And again, in my head, I'm like, maybe I want to go to the chain that makes the most sense for games and social. And so, funny thing about Scale, it's basically a unique modular architecture, but it's really built for mass scalability. And I can't say that's the case for every other architecture design. I've worked in other architectures, so I know this stuff. And so that's what's happening now is we're seeing a pretty massive uptick in gaming projects launching. We're also seeing a pretty massive uptick in AI projects launching. And then social obviously is just starting. But I think the reason why they're picking Scale is not just because of the architecture, but it's built for high throughput, meaning if you're a game or an AI project or a social project specifically, I personally think those are the best use cases for Scale. High throughput means these are apps that are processing insane amounts of transactions. And that can get very costly. And that's one thing. And the other thing for us is because of our unique architecture, we're able to effectively have no gas fees. And so when you think about gaming or social, just as an example, and we've got great videos that demonstrate this, like you're playing a game on another chain and you have to pause the game to process a transaction, to connect your wallet, to clear the transaction. That's going to interrupt your gameplay. It's going to interrupt your consumer experience. Whereas on Scale, you can play one of these games on the Epic Game Store for 4 hours and have no idea of what's happening in the background. And so these videos are great. They're on our YouTube channel, but you can see like on one side, gameplay, constant streaming. On the other side, you're seeing all the transactions processing, right? Same thing with AI and same thing with social. Like I've seen a lot of these early social dApps and it's, oh, I want to do this action on quote unquote Facebook 4.0, but I got to process a transaction. I got to pay a gas fee. And so I think about it the same way. I just want to go on a social platform and engage with my friends or build an audience or whatever it is. One, I don't want to pay gas every single time I make an action on that app. And then two, that's not going to onboard the masses if they have to physically connect a hardware wallet and start doing all this stuff on a regular basis. So yeah, that was one of the reasons I came here. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love it. And in terms of like pulling people over that are listening to this again, building a game, deciding what to do, besides like the scalability of Scale, just curious, what are some of the more, when you're having these conversations, what are some of the tougher questions that you're getting and maybe where Scale might not be the best at today, but you guys have plans to like really improve that area?
Yeah.
And then where are people like, all right, it's obvious we're moving forward with Scale?
I'll start with the obvious one and I'll get into the more challenging ones. So the first thing is I'm a very like transparent, honest guy. And so a lot of times when builders come to me, I'm not on the sales team. I'm a marketer, but I've also been the CMO of 2 chains. I've also been the CMO of a multi-chain deck. So I worked with Solana and other chains. I'm pretty honest with them. I'm like, what are you building? What are your goals? Because if we're not the right home for you, I'd rather see you go to the right home, scale, be successful, because what that's going to do is just bring in more folks into crypto, right? Like at the end of the you see a lot of infighting between projects and chains and things like that. And at the end of the day, it's so early that we're all still on the same team. We're just trying to grow and scale the industry.
Wagme.
Listen, I think there's bad actors that should get pushed out, but other than that, nothing but love for most folks. But that being said, it's pretty obvious. So I'll give you a couple examples. So sometimes I'll get a game dev who's already launched on another chain. And usually it's because they got a grant, they needed the funding. And what they'll say to me is, hey, we built this great game, but no one's playing it. And so what'll end up happening is they'll either migrate over to us or they'll multi-chain. And then all of a sudden they'll see like instant traction. They'll see like people playing their game. And then the other thing that I've noticed that they all tell me, which I'm like, this is cool, is let's say they launched on another chain that's maybe known for gaming. What ends up happening is like the gamers on that chain end up moving over to Scale because, and it makes total sense, they're like, it's the exact same game that now lives on both chains, but on this other chain, I don't have to pay any gas fees anymore. And it sounds stupid. I'll give you an example. Like I used to play a lot of games on a layer 2 blockchain when I worked for it. And when Ethereum was surging or even when it wasn't, I'm still paying gas fees and they sound like small numbers, but I count them up. And some of these games I was paying $100 to $200 a month in gas fees to play them. And I think that also creates like realistic expectations for founders and builders and all of that. And then the other thing I would call out, again, not to knock anyone, is there's great games obviously outside of Scale. I've seen great games on other chains and I've played them. And sometimes like the chains, to your point, are not built for the throughput. And so what ends up happening is, I remember this to a T, there was like a gaming tournament. It was a cool game. A lot of people liked it. And then literally in the middle of the tournament, like the chain crashed because it probably couldn't handle the high throughput. And you've got to think about that. Like the example I always love to give, I'm old, is like Mario. Like I'm playing Super Mario Brothers, and I've got to the final level. I've spent 6 hours playing it. I'm about to battle the final boss,
Oh
and then
yeah.
my system crashes, and I've got to start over. That's not a good customer experience. And then in terms of other stuff like AI, same thing. Like Palm AI, Chirper AI, ChainGPT. I think we've got about 10 AI projects already, but same thing. They're processing XORed, they're processing like insane amounts of transactions. And so a lot of them, what they'll do is they'll join what's called one of our hub chains. So we have an AI chain, a gaming chain, et cetera. And then usually what'll happen is they'll get to the point where they're like, okay, we're now processing so many transactions that we want more block space for ourselves. And then it's really easy for them to then just launch their own chain with us and then just migrate over in 2 seconds. I think the category that has been, I wouldn't even say the word challenging, but like the category where maybe I have more to say is usually DeFi, right? Because a lot of these chains like to point to TVL as like the North Star metric. I candidly think a lot of folks are in for a rude awakening down the road, because when I look at TradFi coming in and doing these partnerships, and I come from Web2, I'm not saying to myself, oh, that's where they're going to build. That's where the liquidity is going to be stored. I'm like, that's where they're going to learn to then build their own thing. Because if I'm a big traditional finance company, like I'm building on my own chain. I'm not
Mhm.
living one else's. And so I think again, like that TVL game is a little bit going to be short-lived long term. And so for me, the metric that I'm much more focused on is unique active wallets. Are we bringing in actual users? Are we building large user bases, sticky user bases, things like that? So I think just going back to that comment, we don't have the highest TVL because, to your point, like we don't have a robust DeFi ecosystem. Ooh, I'll leak a little alpha. So I am a DeFi guy. Like I love DeFi.
Yeah.
I come from DeFi. We are going to start scaling it up. But again, like my goal is I don't need to have the chain with the highest TVL. I don't need to win that war, nor do I think it makes sense. I think for me, it's more about if you think about what's on our chains and you think about what people are building, like what continues to create a better and better customer experience. And I'll give you some examples. So a project wants to launch on us and launch their token natively. Like I want to be able to empower that. Or a project is gaming and they have all these in-game items in the form of quote unquote NFTs, but they're games, gun skins, and things like that. I want all that to be able to live on Scale and be very seamless for the users. Or I want the ability, for example, for folks to swap into a token that has in-game utility. So for me, I don't think the goal is let's go win DeFi. I think the goal is let's ramp up DeFi in a way that aligns with who's building here and what they're building, and also what our customers and users are doing, just to create a better experience for them and remove any kind of friction points they have. Yeah.
You're hitting on a lot of good points that I think it's good for people to learn and conceptualize around the current state of the market, what people value, and like what the reality is going to be. So you already talked about if you incentivize people with airdrop farming or tokens, it's not organic. And if you're looking at TVL, it's not the best metric, right? You're looking at like unique wallets and actual users using on the platform. I guess for Scale, like how do you see, and especially you coming into your role, like what are some stuff that you're looking at as KPIs? Is it number of projects potentially building on Scale that like at least lead to those users, or what are you looking at on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, great question. So, like, marketing KPIs are obviously always very different from like other KPIs. But I would say, as a marketer, like, site traffic's really important to me. Are people coming to the site? Are people bridging? Are people, for example, like, I might even track the traffic coming into the dev center, the doc center, or developers taking notice. So I think at the end of the day, like, that's an important one. I think, again, for me, like, biggest priority right now is just awareness. Like, the tech is incredible, the devs are incredible, the ecosystem's great. We just need people to start to know the name and also be able to associate the name with something. So I would say brand building is also a big priority right now. And then obviously the hope there is that as we grow in awareness, and you can read like the thread I pinned on my Twitter, when people see what I saw coming in here, because I do research quite a bit, I think it all just makes sense. And what I've heard from a lot of like friends that I've talked to even before I came here is they either hadn't heard the name before or hadn't heard the name in a while. And then after they read my thread, they're like, oh my gosh, like now I get it. I understand why you went there. And then I think again, like awareness goes up. User base is a huge metric for me, like growing our UAWs and growing our repeat visitors to some of these ecosystem partners. Because again, like I want to build a very large, sticky audience for the long term, right? Because that's not just great for us, it's great for anyone that launches on us, right? Instant traction, instant success. And then I think because you asked about it. I think like number of projects is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like I know a lot of chains where their goal is onboard as many projects as possible, continue to inflate that number on the dashboards, blah, 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 blah. But I think it's like a bit of a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that is I do believe in this notion of like quality over quantity. So the good news is we have a pretty amazing sales team. So every single quarter, we're like doubling our onboarding numbers. Shout out to Sawyer, who has to like literally onboard every project. But a big priority for me has really been this notion of like quality over quantity. So case in point, if we want to get more liquidity on chain and boost our TVL in order to enable some of this functionality, I don't need 400 DeFi projects. I need 10 really good DeFi projects. And luckily I know all these projects and call them. But same thing goes for, we have again, over 50 games on Scale Network. But if you go back to what I said before, it's one breakthrough game could drive mass adoption. I want more games on Epic Game Store. I want more indie game developers that have never done blockchain before to come on chain. So I think for us, it's yes, we are definitely acquiring lots of projects, but there's definitely also a focus on quality. Or case in point, let's take AI. Like we have a project that launched that's doing AI agents. And I was an AI guy at Amazon for 3 years. Like I personally believe every industry in the world is going to have AI agents incorporated into their business in some way. So I want that type of project on Scale. I want Web2 to adopt that project. And then the other thing I would say is I've definitely been having a lot of meetings with builders that actually come from like Web2 business backgrounds. And what's been really interesting is like they are building for mass adoption. Like I'm seeing a product where I'm like, oh, I would use this product if I were still at Amazon, but what's the blockchain functionality? And then similar to kind of these games, they point to it and I'm like, oh, interesting. You've created additional functionality that leverages the blockchain if I want to use it, which makes it an even better product for me. But you're not building the whole thing on the chain and you're not forcing blockchain down my throat. And so I'm seeing a lot more of those, which is also really exciting. So I would say quality projects and builders that are truly trying to build for mass adoption and thinking a little bit different. Like we always say we're built differently from day one. It's true. But I've been meeting a lot of founders lately that are also built differently. And I'm like, what a great synergy between the two.
So, Andrew, last question from my end here is you talked about like bringing the normies over. And I do agree with you. And a lot of this is don't make the game necessarily for Web3. Do your game and then pull in and see where you can do. How else do you think like we can, and I think our podcast is trying to do some of that as well, is make it more digestible of what these companies are doing? Because what I've found over and over again is in anything in life, but especially in blockchain, I'm seeing is if you don't understand it, it's easy to push it away and pretend, not even try to dig into that a little bit further. So from your end, like, how do you think we can start to pull more people over, or does that just happen organically over time as apps hide it behind the scenes?
Yeah. So the answer is Dunkin' Yo-Yos. No, the serious answer is it is a combination of things. And I'll go back to like when I worked in VR and AR. And again, I see very similar patterns in the industry now as I did in those industries. But I think the first thing is like removing the friction points. And unfortunately, like some of these friction points are created by lack of regulation. But what I mean by that is in the future, you'll be able to download a game on iOS, the Apple Store. You'll be able to download it on Android, and then it's going to have blockchain tech built into the background. But right now, there's just a lack of clarity on some of these things, which makes it really challenging. I think the lack of clarity is also why a lot of big traditional businesses that are built in America haven't entered yet. Like I personally believe, even going back to my Amazon days, a lot of these companies have been researching blockchain for years, or even thinking about what they want to do, or even developing strategies, but they're waiting for that clarity because they don't want to jeopardize their traditional business in any way. It makes total sense. But that's one example. Or when we think about wallets, even, I'll give a nod to like Phantom. I think Phantom's done a great job, but they've built their wallet in a way that is very accessible to everyday people. And what I mean by that is, one, that the UX UI looks very clean, very simple, very friendly to everyone. But then they're doing things like building swap functionality into the wallet, right? So they've just removed a friction point. I don't have to connect my wallet to an exchange. I don't have to bridge assets to a chain to swap. Like I can just do it in there. So that's a great example. Or even the other thing that I mentioned, which is right now, a lot of these websites, you have to install a Chrome extension, and then you're connecting your wallet, you're processing a transaction. I think going back to the Scale example, like in the future, you're going to go to a website, sign up with an email address, create a password. It's going to create a backend wallet. And then all those transactions and all those connections, like you're not even going to be processing them. And so going back to your question, like I do think as the tech evolves, it will remove a lot of these barriers and make it a lot less of a barrier for everyday people. And then there's also things going back to just marketing for a second. Part of it is awareness and perception, right? So I think the average person is aware of crypto, but looking at what FTX did with celebrities and things like that, there's some negative perceptions, right? And so over
Yeah.
time, I think some of those perceptions have to be repaired, which I do think will come from things like increased regulation clarity, legitimate Web2 companies building in blockchain. Even today, I saw a politician talking about a token, which I was like shocked by. But I think, again, perceptions have to shift at a cultural level. And you see this in other countries too. If you go to Korea or Japan, their perception of crypto is very different than those in the US in a good way. And you look at why is that or how did they get to that point? And it's because either they had regulation clarity or governments were pushing traditional businesses into it from like an innovation standpoint. So I think there's a little bit of that has to happen as well, because it's very easy to understand like the potential implications of this, right? So I'll give an example. Let's say you're Amazon and you want to build a consumer loyalty component into the Prime membership program, right? They launch a DApp or they integrate that into their own technology. And now how many millions of people can they easily onboard, right? So I think that's one of the challenges right now is we're waiting for kind of the breakthrough game or the breakthrough social app. But fast forward, Meta integrates blockchain instant adoption, or Activision integrates blockchain into a game and they're putting $200 million behind the marketing of that game. I hate to say it, but like most industries that I've been in early, the adoption timeline or the mass adoption bell curve, it's a lot longer than people think. And that's why I always say, I think we're a lot earlier than the average person thinks we are, because you hear natives saying, we're not early anymore, but you're the early one. So I do think a lot of this stuff will repair itself, but I do think, again, like what's going to do it is either a game, a social app, or potentially a big Web2 company that's bringing in a giant existing user base onto the chain. And then the question becomes like, what comes first? I'll give you a great example. I'm sure you've heard of the game Stardew Valley. That was an indie game, just a breakout hit, or even Stray. That was an indie game breakout hit. So the question becomes, what's going to happen first? A Stardew Valley type event or regulation clarity bringing Epic and Activision in, who then put $300 million behind marketing of a title? Could happen. It's just a question of who and when.
Yeah, I got to give a shout out to my buddy, Cray. You said something that reminded me of his saying where I'm always early, but I think I'm always late. And like he told me to buy Whiff coin literally in September or October of last year. And it was going like that. In my head, I'm like, all right, I'm way too late to the game here, but it continued to just fly and fly. So not to bring in meme coins to the conversation.
No, one thing I'd add though, which I think is important, is you also have to take a step back. If we think about just retail investors, you have to take a step back and understand like the differences between a native investor and a normie retail investor, right? Because right now there's a lot of this notion of, oh, I want to get in as early as possible. And with meme coins, it's very PvP and all of that. But I talk to regular people about crypto all the time because I like to get a finger on the pulse of like how they're feeling about it or what's interesting to them. And funny enough, I talk to them about a lot of these tokens and I don't really trade memes all that much, but they don't tend to be interested in the memes unless they're looking for that. Oh, I'm looking for that get rich quick opportunity. And most of these folks are already successful that I'm talking to. But for them, it's really more like they'll say things to me, Andrew, which companies do you think will be around in 10 years? And a lot of them today are infrastructure type companies. And then I say to them, I like this project because of this partnership, or I like this project because I could see it becoming the underlying tech for this industry or whatever. But a lot of those projects have been around and they've weathered through bears and the token price isn't pumping, so to speak. But I've got to believe that as more of these retail folks come in, they're going to start to think of crypto a little bit similarly to how they think of the stock market. And so I could see a future in 15 years where things like earnings calls are impacting token prices, right? It's just that right now, there's so few of us in here that the liquidity moves around so quickly. But as you guys know, what's going to happen is mass adoption is going to occur, volatility is going to reduce, and then the price movement will resemble more of the traditional industries. And then at that point, when you have everyday people in there, are they really going to invest in something because it's speculative and they've got great memes? Or are they going to invest in something because they think the company is going to be around for 20 years or they're bullish on profitability in the next 3 quarters? Like, I think it's pretty obvious, like which direction it's going to go.
Yeah. And Andrew, I know we're like winding down, but so you're someone that always comes in with high energy, big positive attitude. how does Andrew wind up in the morning? And then how does Andrew wind down in the evening?
That's a good question. Yes, I'm very high energy. This is me, by the way. This is not like an act. This is what I'm. The funny
Yeah.
The funny thing is, by the way, like I go to a lot of conferences and a lot of these anons are very good friends because I don't dox people. I really believe in that. And they meet me and they're like, most of the folks I meet from Twitter, it's clearly that's their Twitter persona. And then in person, they're like quiet or shy or whatever. And then they meet me and they're like, you're loud. So yeah, I'm definitely a routine guy. So let's see, I wake up and then I have like my systems. So the first thing I do is I built out this nerdy thing that lets me scan something like 3,000 articles in 15 minutes. So the first thing I do is I scan through that. I see what the news is for the day, not just in crypto, but like macro, all these different areas that I'm interested in. Then I have curated Twitter lists, which I'll scroll through those to see, all right, what's the chatter among this group or what's the chatter among this group? I usually have 2 to 3 cups of coffee. And then I start my day. That's pretty much it. So I wake up, chug some coffee, catch up on the news, and then hit the ground running. And then end of the day, I am a dad, so I have a second job. So usually at the end of the day, I just try to shut everything down, just spend quality time with him. So usually it's like family dinner and then we'll play in the yard. So some nights we'll have like dance parties in the backyard, or lately he's like setting up obstacle courses. So he and I like race each other in the obstacle course.
Yeah.
And then I read to him a lot. Like I'm really big on education and like setting him up for success. We read a lot of books together. And then sometimes I have a little extra time, I'll farm an airdrop.
No, it's because you have this aura of Superman. And then I was expecting you to say, I run 10 miles in the morning. I drink my kale juice. You're very much like the everyday guy like me. I was like, okay, I can relate to that. I do the same thing.
Dude, I'm the total typical dad where it's like, when am I going to work out? No time for myself, like that kind of stuff. And I think, listen, I'll be honest with you. Yes, I run it at like 110 miles an hour, but I definitely get to the point where I need to recharge. I think everybody does. And then for me, it's like either taking a day off, maybe I'll go surfing or I like to hike or I like to bike. But I think, listen, like you can't, and I learned this years ago, you can't move at 100 miles an hour indefinitely, especially at my age. And so you go until you're tired and then you say, what I got to do, I got to recharge the battery for a day or two. And then you hit the ground running again and then you recharge again. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure to bring you on and we'll have to do this again sometime. So thank you so much for coming on the Blockfield podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if you're interested in Skale, I would say head over to scale.space. That's where the ecosystem lives. You can also, we don't have gas, but we have a token that like helps manage that stuff. So you can fill up on that for free and you can bridge. And remember, there's no gas fees. Another option, go to the Epic Game Store, go download games like Haven's Compass or Stray Shot Fussy Fox. And then on Twitter, we're at Skale Network. And then I'm at Andrew Saunders. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, give them all a follow. Andrew's great to follow on Twitter. So, or X now.
Yeah, we'll have you on Spaces soon. So we're gonna have Andrew on co-host and we'll keep the conversation alive.
I love it. It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, peace.